Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Don Bowman. My company is Agilcus. And today we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is the intersection set of technology and regulation, something that everybody gets right the first time and no one ever complains about. And specifically, I'm going to talk about how regulation around cybersecurity is impacting the water industry. And the water industry traditionally regulation has meant something very, very different with respect to environment. And today we're starting to see it affect the cybersecurity and the automation operations. So my agenda. There's a set of forcing functions. Forcing function says, why are you going to do something? And for cybersecurity, there's two main types. There's internal. So internal could be insurance. Your insurance carrier that you want to get is telling you can't get something. It could be your board of directors or your council or your admin, whoever oversees things. It could be that there's some utility that the cybersecurity is providing something to make it easier for the system to use. So secure remote access, of course, we want that because it's going to allow contractors to work with me more simply. Named features, so somebody could be saying, here's a named feature, go implement that. Multi-factor is the example that we're going to talk about today. There could be corporate changes. We're merging with that entity or we're creating a joint venture. There's two of us are going to work together. We see that a lot in municipal. You see a county work with a city and you see the city work with the wholly owned utility and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It could be upper and lower tier governments. We file with the water board or what have you. But each of those corporate changes creates friction and opportunity. Friction because, user A works for company A and there's company B, and now there's some sort of a company A plus B, but nobody works for it. But it also creates opportunities because now if you can do something more efficiently, you get you get a power factor from investments you've made. You don't have to buy two copies of something. External ones, I mean, the ones we're going to talk about today really come from regulation and legislation. But there's a third one, which is public pressure. Nobody wants to see their name in the news in a bad way. You don't want to open up USA Today and say, see, CEO of local water board has lost all of the public information of all these people. Nobody really stops to think about what that public information is. They just assume the worst. What do they know about you? Well, they know what water you use. They know where you live. They know maybe your billing information. It's the worst, but there could be worse. Let's talk about some sample regulations. These have been creeping up for quite a while, and they're coming at different levels. The EPA formally owns regulation for cybersecurity for the water industry. There are some court challenges on that currently, but they currently do own that. But we're seeing it come in other ways. So there's what are called best practices, and best practices are effectively regulation. If something goes wrong and you weren't following best practices, things are going to go badly for you. And so you may as well do them. And if the best practice for X is this, you're going to have to, even if it's not written down anywhere. But also, um, it's coming from the state level. So Maryland and California have each come at it in similar fashions. So I'm going to talk about these in a little bit more detail on the next slide. But effectively, they've taken the position that it's privacy related. You've got a right to privacy. You've got a bunch of information that's held by somebody. Therefore, they have a duty of care to prevent it from being leaked, and therefore they need multi-factor and audits and et cetera, et cetera. The Florida Cybersecurity Act comes at it from a slightly different standpoint. It comes from a standpoint of protecting their own assets. And it started at the state level and it sort of walked its way down by if there's grants involved, you can't have a grant unless you are compliant or etc. And in Canada, we have some standards as well in this area, and they're more technical standards. Do these things. We're not going to really explain why for you. So first, let's talk about California. Um, the California Privacy and Protection Agency, came out with this thing a few years ago, and it kind of rocked the world. GDPR came out, 10, 15 years ago now, and everybody was like, "Oh my God, we're going to have the cookie battle with the website and right to be forgotten." And they dominated the news for a long time. But everybody was sort of like, "Oh, those crazy Europeans. Good thing only they will care." Well, what happened is California waded into the mix and they created their own rules, which are similar but different. And similar but different is really terrible. It creates this balkanization concept. So, I make a global website. How am I going to be compliant with those jurisdictions? So, option A is I say, well, I don't have to be. I'm not governed by those jurisdictions, so screw them. Option B is, well, that's a bit short-sighted because they do have recourse against me, and I don't really want to weigh in on that. Nobody wants to fight City Hall. So California created these rules and so on around, and people thought they were mostly around data, website collection things, But as a water operator, you have access to public data, and they've taken the position that that public data needs to be stewarded in the same way that anything else does. And they've created the standard SIM 5360C and so on. But they've also sort of the invisible hand of Adam Smith. You've got to file all your stuff with the state water board, and that requires a multi-factor thing with this WB key, and they want you to roll that out downwards. But in a nutshell, if you're a water operator, there's some new things that are coming online as of January 1st of this year. You've got an audit mandate, you've got multi-factor mandate, so they view multi-factor as being phishing resistant. This is what their main concern is that I send you a bad mail, you click on a link, therefore I own your system, something ransomware, data in the cloud, shared, etc. And somebody then finds out that the 10 richest people in California use 32% of the water in the state or something like that. That's exactly what would happen. If you think about Maryland, Maryland also came online this year, came online actually at the end of last year, and they created their Online Data Privacy Act and their state minimums called Do It. It's an acronym for something. But the really one that I'm talking about today is the Critical Infrastructure and Public Utilities, these two laws. And it's defined quite broadly. So critical infrastructure is a very broad term for them. It's anything that's kind of not necessarily government provided, but systematically important for your life. And public utilities is exactly what you would think. It's water, it's electricity, it's sewage, it's things like that. And if they serve 10,000 plus users, they have to do vulnerability assessments on a regular basis. Regular isn't really defined, but it's notionally quarterly or yearly. They have to have cybersecurity plans. They have to go through all of the planning and have the document reviewed and all of that stuff. In practical terms, this is where people like Deloitte are like, oh boy, this is where the billable hours come up. But they have to have this plan in place so that when something bad happens, they're following a plan rather than flying by the seat of their pants. And they must also adopt multi-factor approaches and conduct third-party assessments. So third-party means their inbound suppliers. So if you're an inbound supplier, and there's a lot of them, it could be just some local consultant that did the PLC programming in one of the remote sites, or it could be somebody that's running some big data system or some compliance reporting or this or that, or it could be a vendor that's got a package that's put together with a panel and some stuff in it, or it could be anything. They got to be able to assess them in some cogent way. And Florida, well, all Florida agencies have to report ransomware within 12 hours. This is a tight deadline, my friends. There's some wiggle room there about major and minor ransomware, but I don't know if I'd really want to be the one making that determination because you got to make it within the 12 hours anyway. They have to do active cybersecurity training. This is a common theme. The insurance companies push it, and also the regulators push it. Your staff are part of the solution. You need to train your staff. Your staff needs to be trained to recognize a bad email. This is phishing. I'm not going to open it. This is one of their number one defenses. And they have to do risk assessments. Risk assessments, these can be technical. You go in and you run Nmap across the network and you find a bunch of things that haven't been updated since they were bought. Surprise, this is how industrial works. Hey, it's an Allen Bradley PLC. It's running the same thing that was running when it was installed. Hey, it's feeding into a historian running BT SCADA that's running on Windows 7 because it hasn't changed. But anyway, you have to do that. And risk is really it's the multiplication of the vulnerability times the threat times the impact. That's what risk is. So you've got a threat actor who wants to do you harm. You've got a vulnerability, how easy it is for them to do harm, and you've got an impact when they do the harm. How important is it? And here people tend to underestimate the impact. To be honest, they're like, okay, well, we got this big water plant, but don't worry, we could go into manual mode. But we saw with the Iran Stuxnet thing that the bad actors, in this case, the bad actors being the United States and Israel, but either way, from their standpoint, the bad actors, they got in there and they changed the timing on the centrifuge. They changed this motor's timing a little bit, a tiny little wobble in it, and they broke them all. They wore them all out. So you think about, well, I could move everything into manual mode, but what if the bad actor has destroyed all the VFDs in your environment? Because maybe there's a way they could do that. So this is what they're worried about and want risk assessments of. And then, the biggest risks have to have downside plans and, people create 3x3 matrices and so on. But they did that first for the state agencies. But then they pushed it downwards by, well, if there's a grant involved, any grants that you want to get, well, you have to have the same requirements. The local governments need cybersecurity based on the NIST standards, so multi-factor, zero trust. And agencies have to deploy these. Encryption is the other one. They talk about encryption a lot at motion and in rest, and they need access control and password policies. So if you've ever been in a water plant, I can tell you what they don't have is either access control or a password policy. How do I know? Because there's no password, or it's written on a note on the front of it. And then audit logging. This is another one. I think that systematically the water plants I've been in could do a better job. The machines often don't have the right time because the firewall prevents NTP from coming in. So the machines are all logging at different stuff and they all log locally and there's no remote logs. And if something bad happens, what are you going to do? Go to each machine and see if it's got any local logs and calibrate its clock against your wristwatch and then try to clip, it's going to be really hard to do. But there's the law coming, there's the regulation coming, and then there's the invisible hand of you need the grant money, so it's coming for you. If you think about risk as a whole, you've basically got two primary strategies with respect to risk, unless you assume ignoring it is one. So I guess you've got three. But you can either insure it, which has been really the strategy that most public entities have used. I've got E&O cybersecurity insurance and it pays out. So therefore I'm covered. Or you can control it. Controlling it means, well, we understand our risk and we brought it in so that zero is a bad target, but it's within target for what we have an appetite for. If you're going down the insurance path, in the last few years, they've all changed the rules to be in something in their favor, which is you got to have multi-factor on all users, you have to have offsite tested backups, you have to have active training for all your staff. You cannot get cyber insurance today without those three things. And then the other thing is there was a bit of a wake-up call last year here in Canada. One of the Canadian cities, City of Hamilton, they had a pretty high-profile ransomware system takedown. They were doing all their payrolls by hand and a bunch of messy stuff like that. And what happens is they hire all kinds of consultants to come in and help them rebuild the systems and all of these things. And at the end of it, they presented their insurance company the bill. Said, well, we have a $5 million deductible, it's $25 million bill, so $20 million, please. And the insurance company said, nope, payment denied. The reason is you checked this box saying multi-factor, but actually there were some people on the team that didn't have multi-factor. There's some contractors that don't, and some, you considered some of these teams unimportant. And I use the phrase, it's like having a no peeing zone in the pool. It doesn't make any sense. Everybody's in the same network, and you say some of them need more security than others. It's the same network. But what ended up happening is the insurance company declined to pay anything. And they're saying it's because you didn't enable multi-factor for everyone. If you bring that into the water domain and you imagine you've got a water plant and it's got a bunch of PLCs, a couple of HMIs, a bunch of VFDs, it's got a SCADA historian, it's got all the good stuff. And it's got a singular layer of security, the air gap. And the air gap sits in a corner and it's the same age as the rest of it. It's some prosumer Cisco firewall meant for small business or something like that. And it hasn't been updated forever. And then there's been a bunch of holes poked through it for various reasons, good reasons, but reasons. Vendor A needs to do remote access. And we were working on this problem with this HMI and they did this. So we bought this new thing that has, VxRail and we needed a vendor to help us set it up and calibrate it. So there's an outbound proxy and suddenly your firewall is Swiss cheese for your air gap. And as a consequence, you've got all the same risks inside there times infinity because you haven't done any patching and you don't have any first or second factor. And you're starting to look at, well, the city side with the IT, maybe it could have been better run, but with respect to IT, my OT network is really not as well run, which means that you might not be able to ensure your downside, which means all you can do is control it. And if the only thing you can do is control it, you're either going to be pushed by that forcing function of regulation and EPA and et cetera, or you're going to be pushed by your internal stakeholders, board directors, et cetera, or you're going to do it yourself, but control it you must. And controls, again, you're not trying to get to zero risk. I mean, I think of the sort of the risk in terms of a two-part matrix. You think about the skill of the attacker and the motivation of the attacker. So in the lower left quadrant, you've got accidents. In the upper right quadrant, you've got nation state actors who are going to get you. If you're a water operator, no matter what you do, they're going to get you. That category is very, very difficult to protect against. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do anything, But if you think that you have to either do that or nothing, you will do nothing, and the accident will happen. Somebody will open a USB key that they had in their bag, or they've got a laptop that they moved from the corporate network in, and there's an email they had open, they clicked on it or something, and they're going to find that the OT network has Microsoft Active Directory hasn't been patched. It's got a bunch of SMB. This is malware central. It runs ESXi, but it's maybe version 5.5. It runs all this stuff. They're going to get it, and you don't have any controls. You're going to need these controls in there. So what we see is, I've broadened this a little bit out of water, but water, generically, municipal governments have all these different things, computer-aided dispatch and GIS systems and timesheets. There's a bunch of stuff that is in all different areas, and they've got a lot of different people that work for different entities that have legitimate, trustworthy reasons to share these resources, and you can't get rid of it. Some of the plants are so small they have to have remote operations for certain activities. But some of the manufacturers are now selling equipment that won't work unless it has remote access. Historian in the cloud, or big data, or predictive maintenance, or license managers, or etc. Or sometimes it's just the networks overlap. Maybe there's a building management network and a SCADA network, and they're kind of adjacent. Um, you need to have security, and it needs to be right sized for this environment. And you need to recognize that the players don't all work directly for you. And that brings up the who problem. And I invented the word the who problem. Maybe you can Google it and find it. I don't know, but it's pretty obvious. The who is, who are you? I need to know who you are. And people have had bad approaches to solving this technically. The shared password, or the shadow account, is the most common. They say, well, you work for, you're Joe at company X. I'm going to create you a Joe at my company account, and you'll just remember that. The problem is the user can't remember the passwords. They make them the same, and now your risk is expanded. The worst is they share it. You create a company account rather than a Joe account. Recognizing that you have this shared custody issue down on the right, you work with partners, they work for companies. Their companies do a good job of managing their HR. You trust those companies. If somebody gets fired, they'll remove them from their system. This is really what you want. You want to be able to trust that they still work for that company, and then you control what they're allowed to do. Segue to the what problem. The what problem is, what are you allowed to do? The who is, who are you? The what problem is, what are you allowed to do? Are you allowed read-only access to that HMI? Are you allowed to do this between these hours? Are you allowed to do that? Etc. So if you, the operator, control what, and you allow your partners to control who, then there's the how problem. How do I get them there? Historically, people would say, drive there, show up, put on a badge, walk in the door. That's become a little bit inconvenient, and as costs have moved on, etc., systems have got more complicated at the edge. You can no longer get all the skill sets there. So people then said, well, we'll just do a VPN. The VPN is a terrible solution when you get down to a big room full of old stuff like this, because it means that their network, it becomes your network, and it just becomes one bigger network. And we saw that bad thing happen with the Colonial Pipeline attack in the United States a few years ago. The Colonial Pipeline, gas from basically New Jersey to Houston, so the whole eastern seaboard of the US. And one of their partners VPN into it, trusted partner, they weren't doing anything bad, but it's just that expanded envelope. Every device can reach every device, layer 3 adjacency, yada, yada, yada. What you need for the how problem is recognize users don't sit at desks with direct wired networks. Vendors don't want to install your software. So you can't say as a water operator, hey, we're using Cisco AnyConnect version 1.2 to 3, please install. Because they've got 10 other people that they support. They can't have all the different VPN clients installed. Recognizing that when you join those networks together, you get a terrible thing. You get the risk goes up exponentially. Suddenly, who, what, and how, if you rephrase that, you're going to realize that the end user gets their objective, and this is zero trust, which is the subject of my talk today. Regulation is driving zero trust as one of the best practices. It's part of a greater defense in depth strategy. Defense in depth is a term you'll hear quite a lot, and it basically means don't rely on just one level. You got the air gap, does not mean mission accomplished, my friend. It means there's more to do. So you're going to want to patch, you're going to want to have authentication, you're going to want to have audit, you're going to want to have an air gap, you want to have an inner firewall, and outer. You want to go back to that history book that you opened, and you talked about something called the Purdue model, and realize that they got more than one firewall in there. Level 0 and level 1 talk, but level 1 to 2, there's a firewall. There's a firewall between level 2 and 3, and there's one between 3 and the rest. You need that. So today we're talking about what I call the identity aware firewall, or the identity aware air gap, or zero trust. And that's that who, what, and how. If you have who, what, and how solved on a per person, per resource basis, so you can say Dawn at Agilicus has read-only access to HMI2, then you have zero trust and you've implemented a best practice and you got a big part of the checkbox done. Because now you got single sign-on, you've got multi-factor, so the identity part's done. You've got an audit trail because every time you do something, there's an audit here where there isn't in the VPN because it's just always connected. So you got the audit thing covered. It hasn't really covered training. You're still gonna have to work on that. But now you've done the best practice. And this is where I segue with one of my best jokes. It's called the bear joke. So two hikers are out hiking. They come upon a bear. One guy bends over, ties his shoes to make sure they're tight. The other guy says, "You idiot, you can't outrun a bear." He says, "I don't need to outrun a bear. I just need to outrun you." Same is true here. So the objective is not perfection in cybersecurity. I mean, certainly a noble goal to achieve. The objective is to be not the easiest one to attack. That's your objective. So work as hard as you can afford, as smart as you can, and make cybersecurity better and better and better. And realize there's always going to be nuances beyond that. Zero trust is the one that is achievable. It's not that complicated. Agilicus will do this for you. I will make this very easy for you, I promise. So think about the other approaches that you're using. That VPN, I guarantee you, if you have a VPN and people have a password into it, that it is not multi-factor. I guarantee you it has access to more things than you think. I guarantee you someday something bad will happen. And I guarantee you when that bad thing happens, people can ask you, why? Did you know you had a VPN? And you're going to have to answer yes. It will be an uncomfortable day. I can make that problem go away today. So the good thing about the VPN, once it works, it's like being there. So when it's working, nobody sees a problem. The bad thing about it, you can't really do microsegmentation and zero trust, and sometimes it reroutes your data other ways, and sometimes it doesn't run over cellular, and sometimes it doesn't run on your device. But the ugly part of it is, that colonial pipeline attack here, this is how wars start. When I was a little kid, people had this little signs, no gas, 1973, the war, et cetera. This is how those things happen. Is a VPN took down the gas supply to a G7 country, not for forever, but for long enough that people noticed it. You don't want that. You need zero trust. You need fine-grained audit. You need identity. The regulators are going to come for you. The legislation is going to come from you. The court of public press with their pitchforks are going to come from you. And what you're going to want to say is, I implemented the best practices. We recognize these risks. We controlled the risks in this fashion. This is what we have done. We've got multi-factor, we've got single sign-on, we don't have any shared accounts, we don't have a VPN with layer 3 access, we have a full audit trail. We've done all those things, so thank you. So from an end user, this is actually easier. Going back to my first slide, sometimes you're putting systems like this in for utility. You want to make your team more efficient. Well, what do you currently do? Well, we currently drive to each of the sites every 4 hours and we take a reading. So what are you going to do now? Well, I'm going to have them automatically read by this system. Well, how am I going to do that safely? Or, well, can you get the system integrator on site? Yes, but they charge $2,500 per day plus travel plus per diem. Oh, well, can you just dial them in so we can look at this together? Yes, we can do that as long as we have a secure remote access system with zero trust. So the end user sees is very, very simple. They open a web browser, boom, click. They can see the resource they want and nothing more. And it doesn't matter. They can open Rockwell Studio and program a PLC. They can look at this HMI. They can log in the historian. Their job gets done as easily as any other solution. And it's simpler because they sign in as themselves with their company. There's no new passwords to remember. And you're more secure. Everybody wins. It's non-zero sum. That's what I like. Non-zero sum. It's secure for me, simpler for all. It applies to what the regulators are telling you you're going to have to do. If you're not regulated yet, you're going to be regulated soon. If you don't think you're regulated now, maybe you are. If you're not regulated by an explicit regulation, you'll be regulated by the court of public opinion. Or if you haven't done the best practices, it's just going to blow up on you. It's eventually all leading in the same direction. The attackers are getting better. The attackers are smart. When you're the blue team, you got to be right 24/7, 365. The red team only needs to be right once, and nobody wants to be the one that was in the news because of that. So why does zero trust reduce risk? Well, think about this. So the shared accounts are gone. So instead of having the Jane at his company, or I've now got the Jane at her company account, where before I had the her company account, which means that if somebody left that company, that password is still known. That's terrible. Overbroad access is gone. It means that even if somebody walks up and puts a gun to their head, they can only get access to the one system they have access to. That's the difference between a VPN. You've got an audit trail. Trust but verify. This is a strong motivator for people not to do bad things. There's an audit trail. So when nobody's around looking, you're like, let me just reboot this machine. It'll probably fix the problem. When other people are there, like, maybe let's get permission. You can enforce multi-factor. The legislation says you have to. Now you did. Now you show you did. You met the audit. The audit was a lot less work. Removing the VPN means only the user sees the resources if it was adjacent to them, but they don't know anything else about your business, which means they can't accidentally upgrade the wrong one. In order to software licenses and so on, it's much easier. So the implementation needs, you might think there's a big Gantt chart and a bunch of project managers going to be in your cafeteria drinking your coffee for months and months and months. But short answer is most of our customers deploy this in a couple of hours. It's an identity aware proxy. You don't have to change your existing network. Everything just works the same way. But now you can just say user A at their company and user B at their company has this narrow permission to that narrow thing. Bingo bango, you're done. Checkbox regulation, checkbox increased utility, checkbox, everything. Everybody's happy. So my pithy call to arms, I've talked about a couple of the regulations that are coming. There's going to be more. And the balkanization that we talked a little bit about with the California versus the GDPR, it's going to happen all over here. It's going to be a mess. And everybody's going to have slightly different rules that are all well-meaning, but they're going to be hard to be compliant to them. The best way to be compliant to them is to pick a set of standard frameworks and say, this is what I've done. I can tell you that it's probably compliant. It's going to be easier to say I implemented NIST Zero Trust 800, blah, blah, blah standard than it is going to be to say, hey, I've done my own thing. And that's really what we're proposing is let's make it standard, let's make it simple, let's make it easier to use, let's make it more secure, and then let's tell the regulator that it meets their objective. So with that, I'd love to reach out to you after this call. My team will. Feel free to get a hold of us the usual way, smoke signals, our YouTube channel, info@Agilicus, email me, don@agilicus.com. On our website, we got a bunch of case studies. There's a little chat icon that goes to the team, and we ongoing do these webinars. But thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And I hope that it was a little bit informative. I didn't go in a ton of detail, but to be honest, if I open up the Maryland law and read it to you, I'm not an expert on it. You're not an expert on it, and it'd be pretty dull. So thank you so much. Again, my name is Don Bowman. Company is Agilicus. We make secure remote access based on zero trust for the water industry. Cheers. Bye-bye.